Good evening, members, and welcome the members of the public. Attending this evening, this is a meeting of the Economic Planning and Housing Committee. Some admin before we go into the committee work. Fire evacuation procedures. There are no fire alarms scheduled for this evening, which I think is pertinent, bearing in mind what happened in South Oxford last night. But therefore, if the fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the building immediately. The fire exits are located at the rear and the side of this room. Go down the stairs and meet in the War Memorial Park. If you signed in, we need to account for everybody in the building. Please note that this meeting is being webcast live on the internet. And please can I ask all members and members of the public to switch their phones off or turn silent. Thank you very much. I just want to say something before I start on the agenda, and this is for the benefit of the members of the committee, is that at the end of the EPH this evening, I'll be closing the meeting. We're then having an interactive presentation from the Officers of Commissioning and Procurement to follow up on the presentation that they gave us last September. So I'm inviting the members of the committee to stay behind afterwards for that presentation. Apologies for absence and substitutions. Any apologies for absence? I see some empty seats tonight. Councillor Byrne. Microphone, please, Councillor Bim.
Councillor Cubitt sends her apologies, and whilst we're at it, I'm her substitute.
Thank you. Councillor Jane.
Councillor Watts and Councillor Waldridge will be late because of the trains.
Thank you. Anybody else? Councillor.
No, I'm Councillor Falconer, substituting for Councillor Bean.
Thank you very much. I had a message about Councillor Dunlop. Did I not? You haven't heard. Have you heard about Councillor Dunlop?
I'm not sure who wrote that down. But,
Okay, I understand that Councillor Dunlop will not be attending tonight. If he does turn up, well, fair enough. Declarations of interest on the subject matter tonight, Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. As per my register of interests, I have a personal interest at the moment in Park Farm.
Thank you. Move on to paper A, minutes of the committee meeting held on the 9th of October. Are there any technical comments on paper A? Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. I hope it still qualifies. I'm not sure it's necessarily technical, but it's an observation. And Happy New Year to you. On the leaders paper on Royal Economy Fund, and I'm speaking on the page 6 of 82, the minutes record at the bottom of the page that the cabinet member responded, that should be the leader I think, but then that makes him cabinet member maybe, to some of the committee's comments, and it states he clarified that the proposal is not offering more support to the rural area than town. That's not my observation of that meeting. He certainly didn't clarify it for me. He may have tried to persuade us that it wasn't, but I don't see how a rural economy fund doesn't give more support to the rural economy rather than the town. So I take issue in the minutes to the word clarified, and I'd like that observation noted. Thank you.
if they wanted to suggest, be suggesting the proposal.
We can, okay, without going back to the webcast to look at the exact wording in there, I'm not quite sure if there's a summation by committee services, but there's no reason why we can't change that to suggest.
That would be most acceptable. Thank you, Chair.
In that case, is the committee happy that we change that word to suggest? Thank you, and we will do so. Thank you very much for the clarification, if I can put that. And I will sign the minutes at the end of the meeting. There are no No, yes, I'd just like to go through the formality. There is still a vacant seat for the vice chairman of this committee. Are there any people for nomination to this post? There are none. We will leave the position vacant. Urgent matters. There are no urgent matters. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Chair, I just want to, not quite sure of the order of procedure here. We had written answers to the last meeting of the 19th, sorry, the meeting of the 9th of October, and I'd like to speak to that. I'm not sure where that fits in here.
You have the advantage of me. I have not seen those written
They were
answers.
sent out by the housing officers to the committee.
Yes, they were sent out by the housing officers to the committee. Fine. I don't know that we have them before us.
Well, I received mine.
Yes, we received them, but not as far as the papers before us this evening.
Well, I think the normal procedure, Chair, if the committee asks for written answers and the written answer is promised and then we receive it, then at the next possible meeting where members are eligible to make reference to and make a comment about those written answers.
Quite happy that you make a comment about those answers.
Thank you, Chair. What I'd like to bring to members' attention is that, and I'd like to ask the Chair also to note that this was written question where we were promised written answer. This was a committee meeting dated the 9th of October. That written response was not received by members until the 9th of December. During November, we had a committee meeting on the 13th of November cancelled. And I believe that was cancelled on the surmise, well, the reasoning given that there wasn't sufficient business to warrant a meeting. The answers we received, the response that we received, were very detailed. They in itself warranted further discussion, and I would have said possibly a request of the cabinet member or officers supporting the cabinet member to attend to answer those questions. So in the area of business order, I believe there's been, Chair, a failing here. There is no, I don't understand how it took so long for members to receive the report, the response. And I want to make particular note in the area of the, and it's very difficult if I'm actually talking to members of this committee who seem possibly to have blank faces on the basis that maybe they didn't open up that email and they themselves haven't read the response that officers have troubled to give us. And so that, and again, is perhaps a comment I would make in relation to conduct of business. If the committee asks for a response, an officer's troubled to give a 5-page response to the question. The report subsequently then went to Cabinet and then got passed through. This is in the area of establishing the threshold, the £50,000 income threshold. So to refresh members, this was what this was all about. And how it in particular, what I wanted to comment on was how this relates to the access to owner occupation. And the point that I want to highlight is that the officer's response actually says, makes reference to the modelling in arriving at various assumptions as to what might be affordable or might not be affordable in relation to households with an income of up to £50,000, £50,000 and over. And there's a great deal of detail here. But it ends by saying that draws a note to the committee members' attention that the modelling used, therefore the calculations used to support the established criteria, does not, amongst other things, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categories that are not taken into account in the modelling, the most important being tighter lending conditions introduced in April 2014 and general mortgage availability. So the officer's response is actually acknowledging that a change in lending criteria known at the time was not used in the modelling. So I believe that to some extent renders the conclusions void and flawed. And I'd like that noted, Chair. Albeit in the order that we've received the information, I appreciate rather after the horse has bolted the stable, but I think it should be noted.
Your observations will be recorded, and I'll take it upon myself through the officers here, through committee services, to feed that back to the authors of that document and see if we can't get a response to your observations. Would that be acceptable? Yes. And on that basis, as you've brought it before the committee, I'll make sure that it is circulated to all members of this committee as well.
Perhaps with a criteria that they open and read it.
Indeed. Councillor Harvey?
Could I add my concerns to what Stuart has already raised, for the very simple reason that if the evidence has changed after the decision has been taken, it does raise pretty serious concerns. We raised them anyway. Obviously, they weren't paid attention to because the cabinet member went ahead with the decision anyway. But if the goalposts change while she's been making the decision, then that does raise some pretty important questions.
Which is why I'm doing what I'm doing. Yeah. Okay. Right. No urgent matters. That's what we got to. We'll treat. That was a fairly urgent matter. Now, there's a motion referred from council, and this was moved by Councillor Watts and Councillor Gavin James, and I believe Councillor Watts is here to speak to this. I will just let you know that I'll address it in the work programme. We're not addressing this motion per se tonight. This is not the normal routine run of things, but I will explain how it's going to be handled. It's not going to be pushed under the carpet at all. It's going to be taken in its rightful place in the work programme. Councillor Watts.
Thank you, Chairman. I rather lost my way with this motion because originally it was addressing both this council's position as landowner and this council's position as planning authority. After being discouraged by the senior officers from trying to commit the council to a robust position on the sale of its own land for housing, that was really, in a sense, taken over as an issue by the other motion, which dealt specifically with Nellydown. But how many other sites have we got up for sale? Only one in Whitchurch, I think. So I'd like this evening to ask the committee to consider this specifically from the position of the council as local planning authority. In fact, as I think you know, I'm very uneasy about the fact that this committee is advising the local planning authority one moment and the council as landowner another, and I'm determined that we'll have to change the constitution on that. But the point I was making with the motion is that there is a circular function around viability with the cost of money and the price of land here. And I would like you to take forward as the matter for consideration that the committee recommends that the council shall robustly defend the target for affordable homes against any claims that it's not viable, and that any calculation that purports to prove that target's not viable is assuming the excessive value of the site. As I tried to argue in the motion, and perhaps not very clearly, if the land is allocated for housing with a particular target, then that will affect the value of the land. To then come along and say the housing is not viable, assuming a higher value of the land, is nonsense. We shouldn't allow that. So I appreciate you're not taking it tonight. What I'd like you to take forward is that proposal that we will robustly defend that target against any claims of no viability. I'd be happy to answer any questions on the motion as I put it if anyone wants to ask me.
Mine's the first one. Are you actually changing the wording of a motion passed in full council?
I think I'm enhancing it, Chairman. And explaining it, yes.
Okay, because I'm going to have to take advice on that, because before full council, they agreed the motion as printed. And I don't know. I think what we can do is take a note of what you've just said. You have done. We've got a note of what you just said. When this particular motion comes before us, before this committee, by then we will have certain clarity as to whether we can adapt it at that time. I think that's probably the best way to go. But bear in mind the sentiments which you've put very well just now. Would that be acceptable?
I'm quite happy with that, Chairman, and I hope it won't be long before you do take it on.
Okay, so noted, and we will include that in the workings of this paper a bit later on. Councillor Bimmer?
Can I just clarify whether there is an estimated timetable for it appearing? Because it seems to me it needs to be sooner rather than later. And so is it programmed for the next meeting? Probably not, I imagine, because you've got other things there. So when is it likely to appear is what I'm asking. And I would say in passing, I can't see the problem in when the report does come forward, referring to this meeting and the commentary that's just been made by Councillor Watts. That seems perfectly appropriate without changing the wording of the motion, which is obviously the Council's motion.
Which is why I was concerned about capturing the sentiment of what you just said. I wanted to explain this a little bit later on when we've heard the presentation of paper B, is that we've had to include extra meetings of this particular committee in March. There's a reason for that, which is going to be very clear when we address paper B. The earlier, then we go into PERDA, then we're going, we've got that horrible gap which interrupts the work of all the committees. It's probably going to be June, because the priority is the local plan. And that has to be the priority for this council to meet the timetables for the local plan. Otherwise, we're going to be back into a difficult position until we've got to get consultation and everything else. But we'll go into the details of that planning. Our first look at this was June. If we can change that and bring it forward. Also, the whole subject is going to be woven into the local plan anyway, because we're going to be coming back to us on this particular subject when we review some of the policies. That, if that is the case. But affordable housing will be coming back into the work of this meeting anyway.
Chair, that was my concern, that it is in effect part of the local plan, and if it's get left too late, then we've not got it in the plan, have we? I mean, it's a consideration that must be part of the local plan final draft.
Exactly. So it's a combination. Mrs. Birmingham.
Only to say that certainly, unless the others correct me, that there was nothing from the inspector that would suggest that officers would, as a matter of course, be bringing you back any policy or revised policy on affordable housing. So I just didn't want there to be any, because that wasn't something that was queried at all.
I think the subjects are going to come up in our general review of the local plan anyway, and there will be an appropriate moment for us to address this particular item, this particular motion, as I've said. Councillor Harvey.
Just for clarity, Chair, are you saying that from your perspective that you wish to revisit the 40%? Is it a Conservative group position that they wish to revisit the 40%, or is the officer's comment that we're not going to revisit the 40%, but rather in the context of the motion, it's the application of that we will be discussing? I just want to be absolutely clear what we're discussing.
That was the rationale behind this motion. that it was to do with the application of the 40%. As far as I am aware, from my position as chairman of this committee, there's nothing on the cards to revisit the policy that exists at the moment in the draft local plan.
Thank you, I welcome that.
He said, I'm happy for the figure of 40% housing to be scrutinised. A lot of developers are critical, so I'm not necessarily saying that I will find it sound.
Thank you, Mark, I appreciate that.
With 40%, and it's up to see, let's see what happens when we come out, but we're hopeful to keep it.
Thank you, Mark, for that clarification.
I was going to say in the next session, but at that hearing, the inspector started querying the 40%, but our representative there, was Adam Dodgson, mentioned that several permission had been granted in Basingstoke on the 40% and accepted, and I think the inspector took note of that, which is probably why he hasn't repeated his original comments in his letter to us.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Councillor Watts. Now we have some speakers for item 7. The local plan housing numbers. Councillor Watts will be coming back, but may I suggest that Councillor Tilbury comes forward, and you have 2 minutes.
4 minutes, is it?
4 minutes? Visiting councillor, 4 minutes. 2.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yes, yeah, well, this is a bit of a mess, isn't it, really, this local plan, but I think the problem, the point I made previously with regard to the housing numbers, you know, at the time I said before, you know, you can't have a figure of 748 if you're promoting high levels of economic growth. The two do not go together. So if we don't want the 748 figure to go out, then we need to do something about the economic growth figure. But I think there is another problem, even if we do put the numbers up, is the constraints within the borough. You know, if you look at Basingstoke, one of the biggest issues is if you look at the map of Basingstoke, you've got south of the motorway, we can't build down there. There are no sort of towns, large villages there, and the land never seems to be, I'm not sure if it's on a vale or whatever, but the motorway is an obvious constraint. The boundary, the Manydown boundary is proving to be a constraint because the land is owned by the Borough Council and the County Council, and for years we've sort of not made it available for development, and now it is, and now we're struggling saying we can't afford to develop it without bringing in a business partner. So there's a sort of constraint there that in a way we've almost handicapped ourselves on that area, and if we look at development, it won't come forward for quite a long time. It's certainly looking at much later in the plan, and so the only area close to Basingstoke is actually to the north, and that's starting to impact on all the little villages like Sherburn, St John, even Sherfield, Bramley, and you're getting this very odd level of development there, and where you've also got constraints with the floodplain there. So at what point is Basingstoke going to stop growing? The point I keep making is no one's looking to the long, I mean, this is a 15-year plan, so we are looking to the future more now, but what's going to happen beyond this? So we're going to allow them to be swallowed up at some point, because if we keep trying to grow, it will keep growing. You know, there is no, surely there's got to be a finite point. If you look at towns years ago, if you look at Basingstoke, it had a population of 4,500 when Jane Austen was around, which is the size of Overton now, and it had been at that for quite a long time. It grew a bit, other towns grow, villages have generally stayed about the same, but we just seem to be on this endless growth sort of curve now, which is exponential, and that's, you know, it's not much good for anyone, and it's not even helping the people who live in this area, because young people can't afford to live here because it's too expensive. So, you know, who is actually benefiting? We're drawing people into this area largely because of the growth, yet in other areas of the country, that, you know, they do need economic growth, and they've actually probably got the room to expand. And the problem is, as I say, because Basingstoke is no constraint, the growth is popping out into my village of Overton, Whitchurch, Kingsley, and those areas. We're being forced to grow. We've already had more houses in Overton. With the planning application, we had the hearing on Tuesday for the Overton Hill development of 120 houses, which we assume will go through because we withdraw the reasons for refusal. So I think it's a pretty fair bet that will go through. 120, that's more houses than we were going to get in the South East plan in a 15-year period. So we've already got a higher level of growth. The other 150 we're going to get in Overton. we're looking at treble the amount we were expected to get in the high growth South East plan under that wicked Labour government, you know. But of course the point was at that time they were looking at growth around Basingstoke anyway. So, you know, we're just looking at growth everywhere now, and where is this all going to end? The villages are being destroyed around this area. We are just totally destroying this borough, and that we will turn it into something completely different, to the point where the people who live here don't want to live here. Thank you, John. And that's the reality. Is, you know, is this going to stop? That's a simple question. And, you know, we are accepted higher levels of growth in Basingstoke than all the boroughs around us, Test Valley, Hart, all those ones there. And it just can't go on like this, can it? You know, the south of England is going to sink into the sea at this rate. It's just going to, the country's going to tip up, and it. We'll all have to go and live in Scotland with Alex Salmon, which isn't a good prospect for anyone, is it? So, yeah, that's it. So, I mean, I think. I mean, it is. I mean, it's a pretty desperate situation. You know, to put the housing numbers up to these levels, we're looking at another 1,800 houses, because it's not. You know, we're looking at an 18-year plan period there. Where are we going to find land for 1,800 houses? We can stick a few more on many of them, but can we build them in the plan period? Well, we're struggling with that, aren't we? So where are we going to stick them? Well, I think it's pretty obvious, isn't it? They're going to go all over the countryside, aren't they? And that's not in anyone's interest, I think. So, yeah, so I don't envy your decision, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Tilbury. Councillor Watts. Bottom right.
Thank you, Chairman. I hate to sound like Harold Wilson, for those of you old enough to remember him, but 5 years ago in this council, I said there's been no change of government in the last 40 years that resulted in a lower housing target. And I was directing that at the controlling group on the council, who've been kidding themselves for years and continue to kid themselves for several years afterwards, that wasn't the case. Now we have comments from the inspector under 4.1, page 14 of 82. The submitted plan to be too low to meet the government's objective of significantly boosting the supply of housing. So it's taken us those 5 years to get that in paper in front of us. And that is reality, is a government objective to grow more. But speaking as a ward councillor for Whitchurch, I think for quite a while I was the lone voice in this council, given that Labour were silent on the subject, advocating a higher target than we had before. And the 748 seemed to me to fit in with my own obscure assessment of how much we need. Now for Councillor Tilbury, I would say that we have growth. People are being born, people are growing up, people are forming up in couples, and new people are being born. And in Whitchurch, on the affordable housing side only, there's 139 households registered as in need of housing need. So I and Councillor Dunlop are perhaps unusual in that we actually believe in houses because people need them to live in. Now we've got a clear message from the inspector. It was very nicely put, I think, that there's a high risk that if you don't go for 850, the plan might be found to be unsound. No directive there, no instruction. Very good. And what a surprise that we have a report in front of us recommending 850. The inspector paid compliments to our officers for the report they sent us a year ago, which we decided to disregard. My own view then was it was most important that we got a substantial majority on the council for a local plan. And I supported the view of the cabinet member for planning, and so you have the 748, and now we've got a clear message that it has to be higher. My main worry about this, again as a ward councillor, is that we've really got to do something about phasing, because we have an 18-year programme rather than a 15-year programme, and over 18 years it can probably be coped with. But if we're going to, in the first 5 years, see starts made on all of those houses, we're going to face perhaps in 10 years a time that everything that we've planned for is built out, Are we then going to have a period of silence when not a single brick moves anywhere along, or are we going to get more and more? And most of all, of course, if all the affordable housing comes to begin with, then of course it won't be completely filled by local people. So I think we must do something about phasing.
Half a minute.
As far as, well, we've dealt with affordable housing, so I won't say any more about that. The inspector is also saying that we should be planning for employment land. And if we do, then I must ask that we don't just plan for employment land in Basingstoke, because that seems to have to say in Basingstoke, people think that's what it means. But wherever there's existing employment, then that is going to need to grow. And there's plenty of evidence of this, that the type of housing needs to be there. So the type of employment there needs to be perpetuated. So we can cope with this growth. One last point, the inspector said that our allowance for, I think it's 150 neighbourhood planning should be made specific, and I've started a list. There's Upton Gray, there's Preston Candover, there's Glydston and so on. It does actually mean that we've got to work with all of those neighbourhoods and villages to put something specific down. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watts. I invite Mrs. Stephen Napier to the table, please. Good evening, and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to say very much because I hope that we certainly sent something from Swag and Solve to all of you, which suggested an alternative approach to the recommendations that you have in front of you. For the benefits of the web, if nothing else, just to summarise it, we looked at paragraph 4.7, which is on page 15 of 82 of the officer's report, which sets out the 3 key reasons that the inspector gives for not accepting the 748 figure. One is the 80% moderation, which didn't give a true policy off target. He believes that realistic economic considerations should be used, and he has concerns over the house formation projections being based on the 2011 numbers. The point about this is if he sets great store about Alan Holman's report. And Alan Holman's report, which I've looked at in great detail, is a little bit more nuanced than perhaps we were led to believe. Quite rightly, the 80% removal means that you're going to have more inward migration. But, as Dr. Holman says, migrants generally have larger households, so it's not a straight line increase. Economic revival, there is great uncertainty about whether what happened between 2001 and 2011 was in fact simply due to economic downturn. There is perhaps evidence, and increasing evidence, that the housing market has gone through a major structural shift. And finally, on the 2008, using the 2008 headship rates or for household formation rates, that is not what Dr. Holmans recommends. He, in fact, gives a slightly more median or some medium projection, which would lead to a much lower level of increase. So yes, 748 will not fly, but we don't possibly need to go as far as 850. And whatever number we go for, please take account of any brownfield opportunities that there are, rather than simply grabbing lots more greenfield. The MPPF doesn't expect that for the later years of a plan, and indeed encourages councils to be as positive as possible about bringing forward potential brownfield sites. I really sit here just to, having had circulated the paper, in case anybody wanted to either throw something at me or ask questions.
Thank you very much. I'll just pass a comment that when we hear the introduction of the paper by the officers and the portfolio holder, some of those concerns will actually start to get teased out, I think. Right, I'd like the portfolio holder initially to present the paper, followed by Head of Planning Policy, Mr. Fisher.
Chairman, thank you for allowing me to introduce this topic. Can I also thank Mr. Napier in particular for his contributions and for sending the very constructive paper to us, which is very helpful in our discussions, and I shall allude to it shortly. I think our starting point has to be what the inspector wrote to me on the 19th of December. And he said this, and it is repeated in shorter form within the report. You will also recall that the borough's objectively assessed housing need was discussed in relation to three principal considerations. He means was discussed between him and all of us at the meeting. The headship rates of local households, which determine household numbers, the improving economic climate, including increased economic activity rates, and migration, including the need to have policy off estimates for international migration, all of which have an impact on household requirement for the borough. I referred to Table 9 in the Edge Analytics report. Just pausing there. I've asked that the Edge Analytics report was put in your papers to remind those who were on the committee previously what we had discussed and to inform those who weren't on the committee at that time what it is we're referring to. And you should know, and it is said within his comments, that the inspector found that Edge Analytics their report was robust, that the evidence that informed it was robust, and therefore the conclusions that they came to were robust. It's merely a question of which path we took in relation to that report that has come, as it were, into the spotlight and we need to review tonight. And what he said was this: I referred to Table 9 in the Edge Analytics report, and that's set out, in fact, I think on page 16 of 82. You'll see that there's a table. It goes over the page. The top of the bottom bit on 16 of 82 gives the titles of the columns, which are on the following page. And he said, page 16 of 82. Someone said what page? And he said, I referred to Table 9 in the Edge Analytics report, which sets a figure of 853 dwellings per annum, based on what I consider to be robust assumptions made by the authors of that report. The Council's officer report considered that the borough's objectively assessed housing need of 748 dwellings per annum is no longer the most robust approach to settling the annual housing requirement, again basing its argument on the three principal considerations which I briefly summarised above. This was the report that came out the previous December. Whilst I have not come to any firm views at this stage in the examination, I should just underline that what the inspector has done, and I'll continue in a moment, is effectively said that if we were to continue with 748, we risk that that number will be found unsound, in his view. What he hasn't said is that if we move to 850, that will be the final figure. What he has said is the obstacle which he foresees with 748 will be removed. And that's important for you to bear in mind. Whilst I've not come to any firm views at this stage in the examination on what the objectively assessed housing need for the borough should be, as you know, I expressed my doubt as to whether the Council's figure of 748 dwellings per annum is a sound starting point for the examination. I have therefore invited the Council to reconsider revising this figure in line with the figures in the Edge Analytics Table 9 based on policy off international migration projections, realistic economic considerations, and household formation rates based on option C on the 2008 based headship rates scaled to be consistent with the 2011 census, but following the original trend thereafter. And that therefore puts us into the target of 853 within that particular table. So that's how it gets there. So he's not questioning the evidence that got us to 853. He's merely saying that 748, based upon the trends on 2011 trends, he feels would be regarded as unsound. So that's the starting point, I hope, for your discussions. But I'd like to refer to what Mr. Napier said about the Holman's report. And he if he wrote it or one of his colleagues wrote this, they quoted what Alan Holman said at the bottom of the page, one of two of what they said, and it said this: "There is little to be gained by surmising about the causes of the differences from the 2008 base projection." Bear in mind, the 853 falls into the 2008, and 748 with that tweak of 80% falls into the 2011. He says there's little to be gained by surmising about the causes of the difference from the 2008 base projection, effectively what took place in 1991 to 2000. Did a smaller proportion of older men and women who were widowed live on as one-person households, and if so, why? Was there between 2001 and 2011 a structural break with past trends that will persist? Or is a temporary aberration being shown? In principle, these are important questions for estimating future numbers of households, and hence demand and need for housing, but they cannot be answered until more information is available, including the 2011 data from the Office of National Statistics longitudinal study. So what that actually means is this. As Mr. Napier said, there is a degree of uncertainty, but it's an uncertainty that will not be resolved with facts and evidence necessarily before we have to make a decision. And so you are required to give me guidance tonight on what you think, based upon what you know, is the best figure. And I require that of all of you to come to a decision. And it's not about sticking your head in the sand and say, well, I don't like the housing number and I'm not going to make a decision, because even if you feel as though you're representing your ward by saying so, you would be abdicating your responsibility in terms of reaching a decision on behalf of the borough as a whole. It's difficult. I'm not lecturing you because it's a difficult decision, but I want you to. If it's hitting your target, it wasn't necessarily aimed at you. Yes. The point of the matter is, we need to reach a decision tonight on behalf of the whole of the borough. And I need to know that that is a decision that you are confident with, based upon your understanding of the evidence that we've seen before. Can I say something about jobs? The inspector made it clear in his points that he raised, the following, that he would like us to include an employment target or range in the local plan. It seemed from what he said that he felt that if the question was asked, how do the number of houses that are anticipated being built relate to the number of new jobs that might be created, there might, as it were, not be an answer to that question without putting in a range of jobs that might be expected. And so the officers have come up with a range that, as it were, answers that question as best they can. It's important that we have that so that they sit alongside the amount of new homes. It doesn't seem, I'm sure you will agree, to us that there is likely to be a problem with creating new jobs in our borough. It's more a question of the right number of houses that will go alongside that number of new jobs. I hope that's of assistance, and can I begin by welcoming Jill Fisher to her first committee, and really jumped in at the deep end, and I can say that she has been up to speed on all matters, as far as I can tell, from the word go. So I welcome her.
Good evening, and I must apologise. I'm afraid I've had flu and my voice is still very croaky, so if the voice disappears at some point, apologies. As has already been said, I think that there was a feeling generally that the exploratory meeting was very positive, and that there is a real opportunity for the council now to move forward to an examination. I think it's important to stress that we are currently in the examination process. In that sense, the plan has not been withdrawn nor formally suspended, and the view is that the bulk of the plan and the evidence will remain unchanged, and we're only here really to discuss the issues that have been raised by the inspector. The report suggests a figure of 850 as a midpoint in a range of the objectively assessed housing need. This is a policy off figure. I've actually put a definition of policy on and policy off in the glossary, just because I think that can be confusing. And what we're doing tonight is identifying a figure which we will test against the constraints So this is not necessarily the final figure that the council will agree for the submission to the inspector, but the figure that we are looking to test as we go forward. I would like to say that the 850 is not a de facto acceptance of the assumptions behind those 2008 household formation rates, but it is a midpoint in the range, and as Councillor Raffel has said, we need to take into account that relationship between job growth and housing growth in order to pick a figure on which to go forward. And while I remember, I will admit I've picked a typo in the table on page 8 of 12, and many apologies for that. On the employment row, employment 600 row, the average, so the third column, should read 940, and I don't know how 986 got in there as a gremlin by mistake, so I'll just point that out now. So it's the table, page 8 of 12.
8 of 12 or 17 of 82, and it's in the table at the top.
So it's the fourth row from the bottom.
Under the heading Employment on the left-hand side, third one in.
Third one in. So instead of 986, that should read 940. And apologies for that. So going through very briefly the report, the first section sets out the issues that the inspector raised at the exploratory meeting, and he has asked for further work on. And in response to that, officers are recommending a timetable which is set out on page 5 of 12, which obviously includes this meeting, and then Cabinet in January, and then further reports in March, which will look at the work, and you will appreciate that there is a lot of work for officers to do in terms of reviewing the evidence base for the sustainability appraisal, the water cycle study and the traffic assessment in terms of that higher figure. But we will bring that to you in March, and any changes that are agreed by council at that stage will then be subject to a 6-week consultation period during May and June, and then we would hope to have the pre-hearing meeting in July, with the examination taking place in September, October of this year. So that would be the timetable if all goes according to plan. Moving on to section 4, and I'm sure you're very familiar with the discussions that have been had from the EDGE report as we've gone through. And I've just set out, as a reminder really, the scenarios based on household formation, so A, B and C. B was discounted, but as has been referred to, the 2011 based headship rates are lower than the 2008. And this is because for the first time in a period of about 40 years, household formation rates stopped going down, and they've been going down at a fairly steady rate and remained very almost constant at a national level. And what, as the Alan Holman's report paper talks about, what is an unknown, and as I refer to in the in both in paragraph 410 and 4.9, what we don't know is whether that is a structural change, or will be a permanent change to the household formation rates, or whether that was an effect of the economic recession. It's interesting to note that in terms of the district, the borough itself, the household formation size did actually drop between 2001 and 2011. So it does, contrary to what was happening nationally, the borough did see a slight drop in household formation rates. So, as has already been referred to, the inspector really was suggesting that we need to look again at that evidence, not because the evidence itself was wrong, but he wasn't persuaded by the scenarios that we have picked. And it's probably best at this stage to move on to table 1, which I know is unfortunate that that's on 2 pages, but on page 8 of 12. What we've done there is taken out the scenarios which were really illustrative scenarios based on either an employment figure or a dwelling figure. We have suggested that the inspector is saying that removing that the 80% international migration reduction is a policy on and therefore is not a valid one. And our view is that the migration-led 5-year scenario is an unnaturally high figure. So the area which is highlighted in bold are those scenarios which we think most actively, but best represents our objectively assessed housing need. And so it is really for views on that figure, that the 850 figure is in the middle of that range, and on the basis of the very buoyant economy and recent population growth in the borough, it's our view as officers that the 850 best represents a middle point in that range, which is worth testing to the next stage. Very briefly, just going on to the employment targets, as Councillor Raphael pointed out, the inspector suggested that it would be very useful to have an employment target which puts context around the housing figure. This no means straightforward, this relationship between housing and jobs, and there are a lot of different variables going into that. But in order to base it on evidence that we already have, we looked at the work that was modelled by Experian, which is in the Housing Employment Land Review, and in past trends, and the work that Edge did in terms of modelling that relationship between houses and jobs. My voice is going on here, but on that basis, I'm suggesting that basically a range between 450 and 600 new jobs per annum should be used as the basis for our housing target range. Unless there is any, this seems to be a good basis for that, because there are very strong, we've got 10 years past trend, which is the 600 figure, and the 450 figure is based on the Edge work. So they're both evidenced in the existing evidence that we already have. So just to conclude then, in terms of the next steps, once we've got a figure in which to test, and we've already got work underway in terms of looking at the water cycle study and the transport assessment, we can test that figure against those constraints and come back to you in March with that information. Thank you very much.
Jill, thank you very much for doing that. A valiant effort, but I think you got the message across very well indeed. Thank you. Anything to add? Questions for the officers? Councillor Harvey, whether you're going to delegate this, maybe Joe can help you on some of the answers I don't know, but I'll leave that up to you. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions to start with, and then I've got quite a series of questions. If you want to come back to me at another point, I'd be happy with that. When I get my head around 23 of 82, and what Councillor Raphael quite rightly outlined, which were the two major paragraphs, and I wanted to ask the officers, really, the whole crux of it for me stands around the third paragraph down, third line, sound starting point for the examination, and the fact of this 850 as being the starting point. Could you just clarify for me, in your own minds as officers, are you saying that the mid-range point is the starting point at which you expect the inspector to judge our policies, and he's already discounted 748? So in that context, the debate is not about 850 and lower. The logic of what he's introducing is, I will start with 850, assess your policies, assess the relations and constraints, and decide whether or not we actually go any higher than that. Have I understood the sentence he's approaching that correctly? And if not, that's incredibly important, I think, in terms of the deliberations.
I think it's important that the inspector, the examination of our number has not yet commenced, and that will take place during the examination. And it's for us as a council to present a figure and then to support that figure with evidence, which we will clearly do. So I don't think we should read into any particular figure that he may or may not have in mind in terms of that, but apart from the fact that he's clearly said in his view at the moment, 748 is too low and is potentially unsound.
Okay. That then relates, obviously, as you rightly said, to the employment range. And again, the employment range at 450 is the low end of where the range is you're discussing. Where are we at in other places? Because what's worrying me about this is where our other partners are at. The LEP, which is obviously a key partner and is obviously somebody whom the inspector will take great note of, has a very different position. They've stated at meetings at which our leader has been in attendance that the assessments of 6,300 or 6,400 units across the area of the LEP aren't appropriate, and that in terms of economic growth they're looking at 11,500, nearly 12,000 units across our NE3 and 3 enterprise area. Now, if that's the case, that's a different context to what you're saying, and our leader has been at these meetings. And further, the leader was at a meeting where the LEP agreed in its strategic economic plan that they wanted an accelerated delivery of housing at 25% above the baselines that we've been talking about. And it goes even further than that, that in terms of unlocking housing, and this was agreed by the Joint Leaders Board at which our leader was at, that they're talking about bringing forward this in the first 10 years and looking at the whole process of actually achieving a target will see the delivery of housing accelerated by 54% if compared to the 5-year baseline. Now, if we're talking about economic growth being driven by our LEP at that level, which our leader has signed off on, where does that leave us in those calculations that you're offering? Because that evidence is there now on record. That's our economic strategy. That's what we've signed up to as a council. Our leader has signed us up to it. I presume he has, unless others have got other information, because he attended the meetings. He was at these meetings where this was agreed. So if that's the driver for employment, has that been factored into your figures? Because if it hasn't, it disturbs me.
Obviously, a dialogue with the local enterprise partnership is important, and we've just started that dialogue, and we'll carry on with that. My understanding is that there are no borough-specific jobs figures in the strategic economic plan, and in fact, that there is nothing in terms of particular jobs targets apart from the Basing View figure of 4,000, and it is on that basis that I'm suggesting the jobs figure that's in the paper, because there are no other. We need to be evidence-based in terms of what we present to the inspector, and there are no other figures that have been presented in a borough-wide figure at this stage.
So what is the strategic plan of the LEP then, if nothing but that? Because it's the plan that they're working to. They have authority. The government have given them authority in housing matters. That's been handed down with the Localism Act. They have a very important influence in all of this. And if they're looking at almost doubling what they were suggesting to 11,500, 8,000, 12,000 in the context, 11,800 is the figure in the report, then that is concerning. Because if you think about the Enterprise M3 area, where is that employment going to be focused on? And we are one of those growth points, as the leader has explicitly referred to in the 30-year economic strategy that we've adopted. So if that is what is driving this, I'm not concerned these figures are being robustly at all, whether they will stand up to the scrutiny.
I don't think anything that came into this report, and this is my view for the way I read this, has got any mention of the LEP. Nobody around this table. I hear what you say, Councillor Harvey, but I have no idea if this council, I haven't heard it in full council of you, that has committed to whatever the LEP is doing. There might be discussions, quite rightly, but I'm not aware of any signature on a piece of paper. There's no problem. I personally can write to the leader and ask him your question, but I don't think it's relevant now. We're looking at this report. This report doesn't carry any evidence from the LEP, and therefore it shouldn't be really taken as an influence. I hear what you're saying, it's going on.
But it's more than that. If the LEP isn't referenced in here, if the strategic plan of our local economic partnership is not in here, if we're not referencing their work, and I say here what it says in their actual agenda, the leader attended, that the Joint Leaders Board operating across the Enterprise M3 area agreed that target at a 54% increase in the housing delivery rate. Our leader attended that meeting. Did our leader agree to it? Did he vote for that? Because if he voted for it, where was it approved? We sat in this room in another committee and my colleagues and asked to scrutinise the LEP so that this borough could see what it was doing. That was flatly refused. It was turned down. We were not allowed to scrutinise the LEP. Now we should do, because if they're having this influence, it is very significant, and it's not in the report. That is worrying, considering what they're saying. You say over here, look over here, but the LEP is over here doing something quite different that raises significant questions that are remaining unanswered.
Could I ask the officers, do you know anything about this? Because this committee doesn't, the report doesn't reflect it. But I'm not quite sure why it's being raised at the moment, because it's out with what we have in front of us, and we cannot take account of it.
All I would say is, I mean, obviously the local enterprise partnership is a context for the issue of job growth, and in paragraph 5.5 on page 9 of 12, it refers to the strategic economic plan, which has a figure for the whole of the area of 52,000 jobs by 2020. But as I say, there is no specific figure for the borough. And my understanding is that the local enterprise partnership has supported our plan as was submitted. And that's my understanding. Yes.
If that's the case, then let's stick to our plan for Basingstoke and Dean. What I don't see is evidence. We're talking here about how we go forward. If you want to delay this plan, I'm quite happy to record that in minutes. Do you want questions to officers at the moment? Would you like to ask them? Councillor Behrman before you. Councillor Behrman.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I do hope we'll come back to this in the discussion, because I have a comment rather than a question on that. But if I can just clarify, in a way it's linked with Councillor Harvey's first question, I'd just like to understand from the officers the mechanism as the inquiry proceeds. In other words, we start off with our presentation, and let's assume for a minute we go forward with the 850 as a starting point. How might one expect the process to proceed? In other words, to possibly at the end of the process have a different figure guided by the inspector? Will he say, right, I've looked at this and you've given your new figure and it's based on such and such. However, that doesn't satisfy me and I think you still need to take a little more account of A, B or C, come back with another figure? Or is he likely to say, I've recalculated it and I think it should be another figure? And how much opportunity will we have for making changes, and how would the dialogue, I mean obviously you can't predict exactly how it goes, but the sort of scenario going forward and the likely way in which our figure as a local authority might change as the thing progresses? Do you understand the question? I know it's a bit complex, but
my understanding is that we as council will present our evidence and robustly defend the figure that we have come up with. Obviously objectors to the plan will make their case as well. The inspector will consider those and go away and make his decision. Now what does happen where inspectors make alternative suggestions is there is another period of major modification consultation, but my understanding is they tend not to be on housing numbers generally. They're on other, is that correct? Generally, it's not on housing numbers. So generally, although, as I say, I can't predict the outcome of this, but generally, he is likely to either accept that figure or not and find it unsound. But it could be that there is a recommended different figure, which would then be subject to further consultation before the plan was adopted.
If I may, Chair, if I understand you correctly, then it is fairly black and white. It's, we put the figure in, either he's not convinced by it and therefore says it's unsound, and that in effect makes our local plan unsound, or he might give us an opportunity, to say, right, we're persuaded by the fact that you are not going to change your mind, Mr. Inspector, and therefore we would like to resubmit our figure at a slightly different level, based on whatever information has come forth in the representations, obviously, from contributors to the inquiry.
They are the sorts of issues that you would discuss in the hearings, so it would be almost a two-way conversation between officers and the inspector as you're going through. But ultimately, it depends really on the quantum as well. But if the inspector is not satisfied with the plan, he will find it unsound at that stage, potentially on housing figures. Yeah.
Councillor Watts.
Chair, I apologise for that outburst earlier. 5.5, Councillor Harvey's quite legitimate question, because it's there 52,000 homes in the region coming down, jobs, sorry. So that's going to have an effect on, sorry, yes. It's going to have an effect on their housing figure, because it's got another top-down figure from a Quango that's not accountable to any democratic body. So it's going to have an impact on this borough. We're taking money from the LEP, so we're going to take some housing from the LEP and some jobs from the LEP. So it's a legitimate question from Councillor Harvey. My question is around the forecast for the job growth. We put a figure of 450 to 600. And I can see that's on 5.15 on page 19 of 82, but the evidence we've actually used is a forecast from Jobs Superior that's a forecast they've used there, so that's not fact, that's a forecast. The fact we've actually used is the 600 jobs which were generated between 2001 and 2011, so that's a fact. And then we've got this edge analytical modelling scenario, which when that came to committee twice, some members of this committee are rather sceptical. So they put this modelling exercise in that they forecast 446. So I would say that's a forecast as well. I wouldn't say that's. So the only fact we actually have is the 600 homes which were generated between 2000 jobs between 2001 and 2011. So, but we've got a forecast figure of between 450 and 600. Surely our starting mark should be 600 upwards. So if I can pick this, I'm sure that the inspector can pick holes in this as well. So our forecasts for the housing number should be actually higher. Did you understand that question? Thank you.
Absolutely right. The 600 per annum is past trends, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the future will be exactly the same as the past. And that's the problem with forecasting. The Experian forecasts are very high, and my experience of using those at a local level is that they tend to overestimate. And so I felt that, particularly given the modelling work that the Edge Analytics had done in relation to the jobs and houses, it was better to go for a range at this stage on the basis of those two more reliable figures. But that's what we're here to discuss tonight.
In 5.113 on page 19 of 82, the economic vision is for at least 600 jobs per annum. So we're saying one thing, 450, and then in the next page we're actually saying 600. So yes, but everything, the economic drivers from the government, the economic drivers from this council, are all driving for higher growth. So I think if we're going to be honest with the public of Basingstoke and Dean, we should be saying 600 jobs per annum. I've got another question as well. Sorry, that's probably more of a statement, really. It's on 4.15. I'm just came up on the last many down overview committee, which I was on that committee for that particular night as a substitute. It was on the London plan. I asked a question, but I couldn't look at it because it was in private again. But I thought this London plan was a voluntary feed into the sort of plan for London, where they're looking for basically free areas from outside London to take their excessive housing growth. But the tone of this question is slightly different to what the answer I got from the Many Down committee, that it seems to be that it's to the end a summit will be arranged and growth and additional growth points will be accommodated. Is it still going to be a voluntary, or is it going to be another top-down figure on the shires?
Yeah, I thought it was useful to mention this as just as context. It has no current implications for us at the moment, but the inspector, considering the further alterations to the London plan, said that although he accepted the plan at that time, he felt that it needed to be reviewed immediately, and to that end the London plan will be reviewed, and there is an intention to hold a summit to look at the starting that process and those wider issues in the long term. But that's something that we will be involved with, but is a long way down the line in terms of the impact it might have on us.
Area of who's going to get homes from London, and whether it's voluntary or bungs of cash or whatever.
That debate hasn't even started to be had yet.
Now, anybody else for questions to officers? I've got Councillor Harvey has got a couple more. Councillor Harvey, and afterwards Councillor James.
Thank you, Chair. Could I ask, on the list in the inspector's letter on page 24 of 82, there is a little 5 there that relates to an assessment as to whether the existing and proposed infrastructure would be able to satisfactorily accommodate the proposed growth to the southwest of Basingstoke. When we do that piece of work, will we account for the fact that Kennel Farm has come through and that we'll not be making a contribution to SIL and will not be making a strategic contribution, even though we've included it as a strategic site? Because if you think about the other elements that are involved here, for example, Downgrange is another example of a site that isn't going to contribute in the way that we wanted it to, because we want to keep it as a green open space. We don't want houses on it in the first place. That aside, the point being, if the assessment's going to go forward, we've included Kennel Farm in our, the plan as has gone forward, but nonetheless it isn't going to contribute in the way that we thought it would. Will that assessment take account of that? Because my concern is it continues to make the infrastructure deficit worse.
Yes, the transport assessment will look at the impact of all the sites that are allocated and have planning permission. My understanding of that point is not actually about the funding mechanisms, but more about the sort of impacts on the highway and the transport network.
No, thank you for that, Mrs. Fish, because that raises the issue then if we're talking about impacts on the highway network, but we're not talking about the funding mechanisms. Therein lies the devil in the detail and the problem, because the residents are going to see Kennel Farm built and it will not contribute to the highways network in the way that it should, or we intended it should, and the impact is going to be hugely significant. Therefore, our residents are at a disadvantage because of what has happened. And my concern is that presentation in front of the inspector, again, puts us at a disadvantage as an authority in making that infrastructure case, because it just worsens the infrastructure deficit that we're dealing with.
And the next question, Councillor Harvey? No. Councillor Mrs. James?
The only thing I was going to raise, Chair, was, and Councillor Watts has referred to it, and it is the point about the duty to cooperate. In relation to the review of the London plan and in relation to the duty to cooperate with the surrounding authorities, how will that overlap with the actual EIP? Because if London are developing this, and I know a number of their authorities are, and Boris Johnson is pushing this very significantly in terms of their housing numbers, my concern would be going into an EIP with that kind of goalpost moving. It becomes a quite difficult moving feast to deal with. If that's the case, do we have contingency in how we will be dealing with it as a local authority? Because it potentially has a significant impact.
Right, Councillor Mr. James. Asked and answered. Fine, thank you very much, Councillor Beerman. Councillor Beerman.
How we're going to deal with it, so it's okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, I thought she said asked and answered.
No, sorry, Councillor.
I apologise.
He was waiting for an answer. Paul Harvey was waiting. Councillor Harvey. Yeah. Thank you.
There, if you want me to give an answer. I was only going to say that obviously you need to continue with the local plan process, and things will always continue to change, and you will have the hearings, whatever the situation is at that point. If the situation with London continues to evolve, that will be considered through the process, the same as anything else.
In sort of coming up with this magical number, I wanted to ask a question of officers around permitted development, that we've obviously seen a massive increase in permitted development, that is office blocks that are converted into residential units. And I asked the question back in April as to how many units have been turned into how many units have been turned, or not units, but how many blocks of offices have been turned into residential units, and that was 15 back then. Since then, we now have, well, it was initially, there was 28, but 3 have dropped away, so there's 25 sites. And what I wanted to know, will they be considered in relation to the housing number? So some of those are quite considerable. I would like to know and ask formally of the committee, and maybe we could all have that in writing, as to what does the 25 units equate to? How many units do those 25 sites equate to? So we know, we know that some of those are in relation to the Weller building being 63 units. Will those units be taken on board in relation to the number that we come up with tonight?
Most of the sites that you're referring to are already included in the SHLAR, the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment, which came up with the total for the brownfield opportunities figure that went into the land supply. So yes, they're already included. Any that have come forward since that work was done will also be considered and included as suitable. I can't tell you what the figure is off the top of my head, but we have got a list back in the office, so we can send that around. It's around about 200 and something units, I think, but we can let you have that.
So there's 200 that won't be considered of those 25. Are you saying that, can I just be clear, are you saying that Weller was included in the brownfield in our figures and will be included in the number? Is it in the local plan and will be included? I'd like to be very clear that we know how many of those permitted, how many units they are. Are they included in the site and in our numbers? So in that 850 number.
Simply yes, they are included in the numbers. They're included in the numbers already. If any new sites have come forward, they will also be included in the numbers.
And can I, so you're saying,
Can I just clarify the question? Is what you're asking that whether or not the fact that those 25 buildings potentially are going to be converted into flats, does that allow us to agree a number lower than the 853 in effect? Is that the question you're asking?
what I'm asking is, of those units, will they account towards that figure? So that's what I want to know. My understanding is they didn't count, but I'd like to know, do they count? So will the Weller site, the 63 units, will that count towards that? Therefore, reducing the number elsewhere on Greenfield?
Yes, they do count. They're counted in the completion figures. So yes.
In relation to the affordable housing, because looking at what we've delivered, my concern is how little we've delivered of our affordable housing over the last 3 years. So in 2013, this year, we've only delivered 7% of the houses that were delivered. Only 7% of those were affordable. In 2012-13, we only delivered 9%, whereas back in 2011-12, it was 44%. How are we going to deliver that 40%? What are we going to do as a borough to ensure that we deliver our target of 300 units per year?
In terms of, clearly as a planning authority, you set your policy in relation to what you seek to achieve in terms of affordable housing through the planning process. Clearly wearing another hat altogether as the housing authority, where because, for example, the market has downturned and you're only delivering X market housing, and therefore, even though you're still achieving your 40% of affordable housing, if you're delivering less market units, clearly you're delivering less affordable units on the back of that. Where there's a shortfall, clearly as a housing authority, that's when you have to look at alternative approaches, and that's something that more the council is doing on another hat. But neither Jill nor Joe would be able to pick you up, give you the detail of those tonight, and that would be for the housing team to do the alternatives.
Okay, done. Councillor Berman.
Thank you, Chair. I know you asked that we were not too parochial, but I think you'll understand my next question. I've not long had the paper, so I might have missed it, but I don't see any commentary on the inspector's query about the new station at Chinham. Put very positively, I'd like to think, new station. I'd like to know what work is being done to continue the intention there, as it was in the plan, and I'm assuming that that's not been changed despite the slightly undermining words of the inspector in his earlier letter, and that there is something robust being prepared, and who is engaged with that, which authorities and partners.
You're correct, that's not part of the report for today, and we can come back to you in March on that. But yes, we are taking that forward in terms of discussions with Network Rail and the Local Enterprise Partnership and other partners in terms of looking at the viability of that scheme.
Thank you. I mention it here, Chairman, because though it is Chinham and very much local, it is also strategic and, to my mind, has a relevance to employment numbers, certainly because some of the users in the Chinham Business Park had an expectation of that facility. So it all ties in together, and that was really where I'm coming from.
Councillor Parker.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like just to go back to this jobs creation question. I want to just ask directly of officers, is this council's economic vision relying completely on past trends?
My understanding of the economic master plan is that there are no jobs figures in it per se, and therefore when I wrote this report, my understanding was that it was supporting at least the figure of 600, which is past rates, and that's the basis on which we have recommended this range. We don't have an alternative figure which is published in any document or approved by council, which we could use as a higher figure, and so that's the basis for why we've picked the 450 to 600.
appreciate this is really difficult in the sense of transitional and new into the position. But Chair, if we would say our case is being made to the Inspectorate, that this is what we did in the past, this is likely what we're going to do in the future, then for certain he's going to challenge that, and quite rightly so. Earlier in the report, there's reference to the anticipation of delivery from an additional 4,000 job creation in Basing View. So we have got some sort of suggested figures for that can be possibly indicating a growth. So that's my question. Come back to it, assuming we're going to continue with a debate. I do want to just ask in relation to paragraph 7.1. This is the curved ball, and I probably do have to apologise for it. On page 20 of 82, it makes reference to the consultants' fees of £30,000 to 1415 being funded from savings in the employee budget for the planning policy team. My question is that advisable?
We have lost a member of the team, and it's not something that I would have liked to happen, and we need to replace. And we have appointed someone, but they won't start until the end of March, and therefore we have some savings on that basis. But I take your point and I agree with you most wholeheartedly. We need to staff up the team.
The answer with considerable relief, Chair.
I'd like to make a comment on this 600 employment figure and the uncertainty of the future, which is classically hit Basingstoke right between the eyes in the last 10 days, when 200 jobs just disappeared from this borough council because a retailer in the commercial industry decided to pull out. You can't forecast that. So a range is, in my view, my personal view, a very good thing to work upon. If you actually start putting a hard number in here, and then you get the disappointment of a commercial organization just for market reasons pulling out, we're never going to achieve anything. But I think again, I'm commenting on my personal view on this, is that 450 to 600 is reasonable. And I think that's the word we've got to maybe consider. Any more questions to officers?
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question. If I go to the letter to Councillor Fell from the Inspector, I just wanted to clarify, in paragraphs 2 and 3 on page 2 of the letter, my feeling and understanding is that he is indicating to us, as putting the plan forward, that he is satisfied with the table 9 in the Edge Analytics report. And it's basically within that table, he is then saying the preference, although not indicating which one he wants, but indicating a preference for a statistical base which is demographic rather than jobs and purely economic led. So he's looking for a mix within that, coming up to the housing figure and leading with the demographics as opposed to anything else. Is that a fair understanding? Thanks.
Councillor Peach.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to understand a few things. On paragraph 5.8, it talks through the whole section around employment of forecasts, and because, as we said earlier, forecasts are not always not for certain, so you've taken the item that's certain, so you take the average between 2001 and 2011. I'm wondering, I know it's not our decision, it was the planning inspector to come up with this, but our forecasts, if you like, are in the table at page 7 and also 8 of 12. Could it be that we could, so what I'm getting at is, if you can use the average unemployment between two dates, and we've got the option in this table to use the average between two periods or two forecasts, if I'm reading it right, correct me if I'm wrong, that means rather than 853 it would be 807, because that's using the average between A and C. So is there a reason why you can use why they're looking at averages in one area, but then other forecasts you're not considering the average?
We're not required by government to provide a jobs forecast, but the inspector says that it's preferable in terms of setting that context. So, and he quite accepted that that context might be in terms of a range. So that's jobs. In terms of housing requirement, we've looked at a number of different scenarios, and as we've said, there are serious uncertainties about predicting the future, not least in terms of that household formation rates. But we need to pick a figure. So what we're saying is that if we narrow down, because previously we had all of those options as our objectively assessed housing need, we've kind of narrowed that range down from 915 to 807. And if we look at that as a range, rather than going for the lowest figure, we're going for a figure which is slightly higher than the bottom of that range.
Thanks. And my other question was based on paragraphs 3.1 and then all the numbers thereafter. And it's considering, so I understand this from my own mind, is that we're considering the revised number as per the inspector, and then he identifies that there could be possible constraints with that number. So we might put 850 out there, but it says here 850 would be acceptable on pollution to the River Loddon. And I'm assuming when was the last study done on the river? I don't want to tread on old ground or anything, but when was the last study done on the River Loddon to know whether that would have an impact?
Sorry, can you just let me know which point you're referring to? That's part of the assessment work that we're currently undertaking, and as I said, if we use the figure of 850 to test, then we will be working with the Environment Agency to remodel the impact of that figure on the River Loddon. So that would be work which is currently being undertaken. In fact, we have a meeting with them next week to discuss it further.
Okay, thanks. And so I'm going to write a similar sort of question on point 5 on the same page, is regards to the infrastructure. So an assessment to whether the existing infrastructure is able, I think we all know the answer to that is no. The proposed, I'm assuming if we could afford to pay for it, which I think we know we probably can't afford to pay for everything, would it be fair to say just picking out those two items there, because I know there's a worry that we say 850 and the immediate reaction is this is going to be an even higher number, but if your reports come back and suggest that these are constraints and they are particular concerns, then there's nothing stopping the inspector from looking at that 850 and perhaps reducing it further.
That's correct, and that's the work we're undertaking presently.
And that neatly brings me to the point when we'll start having time for a debate, but I'd like to come back on that very point and just remind members about the recommendations that we're aiming for. Is that 850 should be identified as a policy off figure to use as a basis. I'd just like to make that clear. We've said it 3 times now, and I'm going to say it for the 4th time. It's used as a basis. It's not a number. We've got to start somewhere, and we're starting on the suggestion from the inspector, and that's a pretty good place to start. It's like any plan. It goes through various iterations, and as we're, if you like, answerable to some degree to the planning inspectorate, it's a good idea to go along with the suggestion. And the point that Councillor Peach makes, it could be, and there's a lot of factors for the work to go forward from tonight onwards on that 850 that could become constraints when the 850 doesn't become viable for various reasons. But that exercise has to go through, which is why there's a lot of work for the officers And there's a lot of work for this committee coming up in March, which we'll address on the work programme. So just, would you like to just remind the committee?
So just to be really clear on that, because I am concerned about the recommendation and the wording of it. Are you saying, looking at the timetable on page 5, that what goes out to the public, at what point do they get a figure? Are you saying, as from tonight, and when it goes to cabinet, it's 8? What work is going to be done by the officers at what stage that might alter that figure? Just so I'm really clear.
Yeah. So the committee and cabinet and full council meetings in March will be those meetings where the final figure that will be in the submitted plan for the inspector will be agreed. So this is not agreeing the figure at this stage. This is agreeing this is a basis for testing. And a policy off figure. Yeah.
Can I just say something, Chairman?
Please
I
do.
just want to make sure that all councillors understand this, because some of the terminology can be confusing. We're trying to set a policy off figure tonight, or at least make a recommendation to me, for which the officers will then follow up in the meantime, so that when we get to the beginning of March, you can then listen to what the constraints are and determine whether that has an effect upon the figure that you decide tonight. You have to be aware that those constraints, which we know exist, may have no effect on that figure, but they may have an effect on that figure. So we just don't know the answer to that question at the moment. So you are deciding a figure without those constraints being applied, in the anticipation that they might amount to something that applies upon it, but might not, in your consideration in March. In March, the figure that you then determine, having analysed and looked at the constraints, and you will make a recommendation to me about whether the constraints are sufficient to reduce the figure you decide tonight. In other words, a policy on figure. And you may decide that they're not, or that they are. And then it's the result of that that then goes into the mix for site selection. And then from site selection, we go to decision and I think full council and consultation. I hope that does that.
And as part of that, in coming back to us, can we ask, in relation to what Councillor Harvey raised around the strategic economic plan of the LEP and what the leader of the council has signed off, could we be clear in relation to the driver? Because at the moment we're told the figure for employment is 450 to 600, whereas over the last 10 years we've been achieving 600, sorry. So we need to be clear as to what the strategic direction of the LEP is going, because obviously if that is a different direction, 450 to 600 is something we need to review again in March. Can I have...
Yes, but you have to bear in mind that what they were considering wasn't the same as what we're considering. They weren't considering edge analytics. They were considering everything from the jobs perspective. And that's why they came to the scenario they did. This is taking into account the constraints that we have and the evidence that we have, our own population growth. And that's why edge analytics has been found to be robust by the inspector. And that's why it's our starting point for the considerations that we have. But we'll look at clarifying that, obviously.
But we've been told, and we've had, in this same committee, we have presentations. A few months ago we had one on the rural economy and where they're trying to get more jobs, and everything's about a driver in relation to economic delivery. If we've been delivering 600 jobs for the last 10 years, to have a 26% reduction and to 450 isn't an economic plan that I don't think that you're all signing up to. And I just want to be really clear, is that the direction of this council? I mean, to have that variation from 450 to 600, it doesn't seem to be a very successful economic plan if you're considering that you're going to possibly doing 450 jobs. I just want to be absolutely clear that's what we're saying.
You're being told that we're looking at a range, and that's what we've said consistently, and we're looking at a range.
Right, going back to the recommendations. 850 is the starting point. It's the number we agree tonight, but it's subject to an awful lot of work by the officers to determine what the impact the constraints are going to have on it. Bearing in mind that 748, the inspector has indicated that if that was put forward, it'd be unsound.
So I did raise, only because it's out there, only because various people are no doubt going to raise it with us again and raise it at inspection, the possible grey area within the Dr. Holman's report, and none of you have sought to ask the officers any questions on that. Can I invite you just to pause for a moment to consider whether you do want to ask the officers about that, because you will be making a decision that effectively will be saying, well, we reject that or we accept it, but it'd be quite useful to thrash it out now so I can hear what's going to be said and determine whether I need to take account of anything.
Councillor Parker.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask what's the officer's view with regard to the comments made by the inspector on the Holman report?
And I'd like to refer you to paragraph 4.10, which seems to me that the paper is very useful in setting out what the issues are, and this very significant change from a previous trend to household formation rates being very stable. And the Holman's report himself does not categorically say this is the result of the economy or this is the result of affordability issues, because nobody knows that until we know what the future will bring. And it is, it is a key question, and that's why I suppose my view would be that we are not accepting the fact that the 2008 based household projection should be the base, but that when we look at the range that we've been presented with through the EDGE work, we can look at a figure which is in the middle of that range and not at the bottom of it.
Happy, Councillor Parker?
I think you should ask that question of the portfolio holder, Chair.
I'm very grateful for your question, Councillor Parker, and I think it's useful because if we don't discuss what's been raised by a member of the public representing certain that will be regarded as ignoring it. So therefore we've discussed it, or starting to discuss it, and we heard what the officers are saying about it, and it informs our discussions. So thank you.
Harvey.
I mean, in terms of the evidence, Councillor Phelan, you've sat through this, you sat through obviously the first bit, you've seen this more than any of us have. I mean, what is your opinion? I mean, as a backbench member to you as the cabinet member, where are you on this particular view of the evidence? Where do you see it? From that point of view, I think that would be very helpful. I'd like to understand that, really.
I think the last bit makes me more cautious. Even more cautious. No, my answer, I haven't made my decision. My decision. Here to listen. Right. No, the difference is, Councillor, can I answer, Mr. Chair? The difference I can say to Councillor Harvey is this, that I have said what I believe was right at every full council meeting that we've made a decision, and I've argued it, and the majority of council have agreed with it. Unlike the Labour group, who's categorically failed at every single situation to say what figure that they would support. led to the suspicion that Labour Group actually want to have about 1,000 houses built per annum, for various reasons. And they can't refute that. If they disagree with that, they turn around and say, well, actually, no, we've always supported 748. We're just a bit shy about saying it. We support 853, but we're a bit shy about saying it. It's very easy to say what's wrong with something. It seems to be very hard to suggest what would be right for the Labour Party. Now, unlike the Liberal Democrats, who regularly say what they believe in, believe it or not, on this issue, they've come out from start to finish to say what they believed in on housing numbers. They gave a range 4 or 5 years ago, and they were happy with 748 because it fitted into that range. And they gave comments, because when we had previous debates, there were several numbers swinging around, and they argued and discussed why they preferred one than the other. Generally, the independents have said various things about what they thought. Councillor Tilbury has always said that there's a whole number of issues, but in reality, it all seems too much to him. Councillor Bierman has said he's not shy of there being new development because it's got to support people in the borough, but he's concerned about where it's going to go. And as far as the Conservatives have said, they said we've got to reach a decision, and we have said what it is. It's been 748. So I'm not going to be forced into telling you what I think before I've heard what you're telling me, because that would be a bit silly. All right? So you can tell us what you think, and I will listen and see if I agree with you.
Thank you. We'll stay off the individual party politics if we can, please, and come back to the paper. It's recommended that the committee recommends to the Cabinet that 850 be used as a basis for further work on the local plan representing the objectively assessed housing need. Policy off. That's what the target is. Figure for the borough, and recommends the Cabinet that the range of 450 to 600 is used as the starting point for further work to identify a jobs target for the borough. A jobs target. Debate. Councillor Behrman.
Let me stick my head above the parapet. It's easy in a way because I'm here substituting for Councillor Cubitt, and though independents all have their own minds and no whipping or anything like that, on this occasion, she and I are of a like mind, and her view was that given all the circumstances, the recommendation in the report is about right. Certainly, she didn't have a better suggestion, nor do I at this point. Thank you for fairly representing what I've said in the past, portfolio holder. Couple of comments though. One is I certainly welcome this bringing the employment numbers into the picture, because to my mind they are linked, and this question of economic growth has to be addressed in terms of how one links the accommodation for the people who are going to help grow this economy, and it can't all be done remotely. So and indeed we don't want too many people travelling from Winchester or who knows what to service the jobs in Basingstoke. I'd like the people who are servicing the jobs in Basingstoke as far as possible to live in the borough, preferably in walking distance of their workplace, but that's probably looking at something that may never happen. The other thing that I would like to return to is this question of the LEP. And look, the LEP isn't in here, and we're being guided to the idea that almost that is irrelevant. I don't believe that's the case, and I'd just like to make a comparison, and that is the issue of what's happening in the strategic road network around Basingstoke at the moment, that is basically being dictated by the LEP, and various things have happened on that particular front, and I, being interested in the topic, have sought to intervene and basically been told, well, the money's been allocated by the LEP and that's what's there to spend and no more. And the LEP is, by its hands on the purse string, is dictating policy. And I think in this particular relationship, we have to bear in mind what is being said and done within the LEP. Now, it could be, well, it's been said, what has been said at the LEP so far is not relevant to our local plan. It's not deciding what's going in our local plan. Well, we then need to fairly quickly go back to the LEP in view of what Councillor Harvey reported earlier and say, even though you might have got the impression from the statements by our leader that we are subscribing to this massive increase, that is not what is in our local plan. Please be aware of it, because if it's not in our local plan, we aren't going to go along with it. Though I have to say, I fear that whatever's in our local plan, the LEP, which is so massively supported by central government, is possibly even going to start sticking two fingers up to the local plans, because their power seems massive. And we were promised a bonfire of the quangos, and here's the biggest and most powerful quango on earth almost going and deciding our activities. I think it's very important at this stage we sort out this question. Is it going to have an influence? If it isn't going to have an influence, which is sort of the message, not very firmly, but the message that we've got back, then that needs to be clear, and we need to be sure that that can be so. If it is going to, and if that's the case, we need to make it clear to the LEP that that is our understanding of the process and how things are going to move forward, or we have to start recalculating very rapidly to take into account what the LEP is expecting and will demand of us. And I really think that this is a big issue that's going to cause an amazing crash of wills and intent if we don't get it sorted out sooner rather than later. So I feel that very strongly. Sorry, I know I mentioned Chinham Station earlier. You might say, well, why in this context? One of the things, if I may just quickly come back to that, that Network Rail have been saying that they've almost accepted at one stage that the technicalities of getting space on the track and starting and stopping and all the things that go with it can be sorted now. But the thing that they keep coming back to is economic development, usage of the station, where are the passengers coming from, and so on. And that's why what we're talking about here has quite a relevance to whether Network Rail are going to be persuaded about the station. So that's why I mentioned that. Thank you, Chair.
Would I suggest, are you moving this recommendation then, Councillor Bierman?
As I always come, like the portfolio holder, to listen to the debate, and I might be, after the debate has taken place, persuaded to go in a different direction slightly. I'd like to hear a few more comments, but I'm in principle, yes, you can put me down as minded to.
Thank you. That's Mrs. James. Councillor Watts, you did have your hand up. Councillor Watts, if you don't mind, and followed by Councillor Jones.
Thank you, Chair. Here we go again, Mr. Chairman. More delay, more cost. I think the cost of this local plan so far is £500,000, excluding the judicial review costs, which is about another 300 to 400,000. So we're knocking on £1 million, and we still haven't got a local plan. Nearer £1 million. By the time we finish, it will be £1 million. Yes. So we've got more planning by appeal. No 5-year local plan. No money for infrastructure every time we lose a planning appeal, as Councillor Harvey has already alluded to, over many sites that have gone through. A year ago, this paper came to this committee, and the officer recommendation was 807. I actually voted for that. A Labour Party councillor voted for that figure, and so did Councillor Keith Watts as well. But the committee decided to vote for Councillor Leake's and Councillor Cubitt's recommendations of what the figure was, 7448, and the inspectors kicked that out before it even went to inspection. So we don't need lectures. I certainly don't need lectures from the portfolio holder. I'm always been resolute. I believe that we should look at this evidence base, and this committee and this council is not looking at evidence base, quite frankly. This council is wearing two hats. It's quite happy to take the LEP money, the government money. It's quite happy to have the job growth once the new businesses, but then it says, well, we don't want the new housing. The two go in hand, I'm afraid. And this council is playing fast and loose, basically. And then this evidence in this report, again, I feel sorry for the officers that they've been dealt a bad hand by this council, but they're trying to make a fist of a bad meal, quite frankly. So the evidence is there. You look at the evidence for the 10 years between 2001 and 2011, it was 600 job growth per year. And then all of a sudden we pluck out this figure of 450 to 600. The evidence is there. As I said in the questions, if I can point it out, I'm sure the inspector is going to notice that. And all the infrastructure, where is the money coming from the infrastructure? We had when this came to committee, whenever it was, there was a massive infrastructure deficit of 350 million, if I off the top of my head. The money isn't there, and that money isn't going to come from government. While we haven't got a 5-year local plan, that we're losing money from developers from 106, and we haven't got a seal. It's just a disaster. And then you turn around and you blame the Labour Party for the delay. It's not the Labour Party that caused this judicial review. If you were sensible in this 5 years ago, we would have got, if you were sensible over the many down figure, having homes on many down, you would have got a figure of below 500 through, and we would have been sitting pretty with a local plan. And
this is history, Councillor Watts. Can we address this report, please?
It's all relevant history. You let the portfolio holder rant and rave on, and now we're having a rebuttal in, and then you interrupt all the time.
This was a debate on this report.
Yes. Well, history, as you say, history is very important. History is pointed out in this particular report, and this is my perspective of the history of this borough. The shambles that it's actually left this borough in, with no local plan and £1 million in costs. Anyway, where do I think a figure? I think the officers are trying to put a figure of 853. It's a reasonable benchmark. You know, I'm quite willing to support that as a benchmark. But I think all the evidence is there. It's going to be higher, and I think this council is playing fast and loose with the residents of the borough. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watt.
Thank you, Chair. It strikes me we are where we are. I mean, I've only been in this council for 8 or 9 months. And it strikes me that there is a need to put a plan in place, and that in that respect it's beholden to make a decision of some sort, to make a timetable to go ahead so that something happens, and that this borough does actually have a plan. As far as the timetable concerned, it seems very tight, but to make that happen, something has to move forward. And looking at the evidence base and looking at what the inspectorate have said, is there is seemingly a match which says, okay, there's a figure which is a plan figure to start on, which is a policy off figure which may change it hopefully, or whatever you want to put on it may or may not reduce in the future. But the first thing is, to me, that makes sense. It makes sense to do something which then produces a set of work, which means this goes ahead and goes to examination in September, which means that maybe in the right reading of this and the right working of it, that actually then we'll end up with a plan. So frankly, to me, 853, whichever way you look at it, and it's been given a clear steer that the basis of that is something which is statistically and evidenced within the reports that the inspector accepts, is the way to go ahead. And from that also, it's indicated that the basis of that decision should be based on the demographics and economics which are produced in that analytic report, rather than taking the point of saying anything else outside of that. And that's acceptable to the inspectorate, so fine, then go ahead with that as a figure.
Thank you. Councillor Mrs. James.
When we were presented with at the last at P&I, when we was asked to come up with a figure, officers made a recommendation that was overturned by the Conservative administration at the time. That has cost this borough to be in this position that we're now into this delay. We're looking at the examination of the local plan not being until possibly, if we're lucky, September. I guess it's going to be about an 18-month period before that process will take before we have a local plan. This has cost us 30,000. We're told we're going to achieve that through savings. As Councillor Watt said, the cost of this local plan is incredible. I have grave concerns about the recommendations in relation to the second recommendation, that it talks about the starting point in relation to jobs being 450 to 600. Everything that this administration is doing is about driving economic growth. All of the policies, all of the work of this council is about economic growth. And those that sit on the LEP from this council is about economic growth. From over the last 10 years, we've had 600 jobs. Why suddenly would it drop to 450? It would be an absolute failing of this administration if you say that your economic plan is going to achieve a range from 450 to 600. You cannot be very confident of the government and the direction of travel of the government if that's what you're saying. And it doesn't seem that, I just can't believe it. And therefore, I just really can't support that recommendation, because I don't think it's based, as Councillor Watt said, on evidence. I would like to look at that in some more detail. I think it's really important. I think it's prudent on us to do that, because I think we're being dishonest to the public if we don't do that. I think we're saying to them, don't worry, this is what we're going to achieve. This then gives you the figure that you want, which is 850. When the inspector looks at that against all of the other policy and the suite of policies, because you're talking about this being policy off, once you start to look at the policies, it's going to change that figure dramatically. And again, we're going to be in the position of not having a local plan. What is the most important thing is the 5-year land supply. We need to have a 5-year land supply. We're incredibly vulnerable, and we need to think about that as this committee, how we're going to achieve our 5-year land supply. It's almost going to become almost irrelevant whether we have a local plan, because what's going to happen is all of the sites that we have in the local plan are going to come forward. We've seen most of the major sites already come forward, and as Councillor Watts has said, they're not delivering against SIL because we don't have SIL. They're not delivering against the requirements of 106. It's farcical. The whole thing is such a mess. And the people that lose out are the borough and the residents of this borough. But I think it's important and it's prudent on us to be absolutely honest in what goes forward. And I don't think that I'm confident of that recommendation.
Thank you. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. This committee has a recommendation in front of it, and the purpose of these committees, when it was established by the constitutional group, was to establish a consensus. It's pretty clear, I think, that there are very different views sat around this table. So if this committee wishes to come to a majority decision, I don't think that is a reflection of where the Constitutional Working Party wanted to take this. I think, and we could move an amendment to this effect, that the committee's views, all of our views, regardless of coming to a particular singular figure, should be taken back to the Cabinet member for consideration. That's the purpose of what we should be doing here. All of the views should go back to the Cabinet member to be carefully considered. And I know he will do, because he has done that thus far. And my comments here are not directed at Councillor Raffel at all. They're directed at the administration. And I want that to put that on record. In terms of this, let's just think this through. I think there's so many different competing elements to all of this. And I think it is about time we had some honesty here, because the LEP is driving a very different agenda. I mean, their board meeting, their strategic plan that we've signed up to is very clear. This isn't something that they're thinking of doing. This is what they've adopted. We have signed up to this because we have adopted it in terms of our 30-year economic plan that the council leader sat in front of committee and it went through cabinet. And it says that through our housing activities, we aim to accelerate the delivery of housing by up to 25% above the baseline, meaning that with government support over the next 10 years, up to 11,500 new homes will become available more quickly. They're very clear what they're about. That is in contrast to what we have been about over many years. We've gone from 594 to 748. We're now talking about 853. You know, this figure moves around, and it's going to move around even more. Yeah, just simply sticking your finger in the air and picking one number out is meaningless in the context of this wider issue. So on the one hand, we have this massive agenda for economic growth. Why do we have that? Well, because we've been a centre for major multinational corporations over many years. We've been a centre of economic growth for a huge small business sector in our town and in the rural economy. We've been a sector that has generated significant growth, not just over 10 years, but over the past 20 years. Under both Labour and Liberal Democrat and previous Conservative administrations, we've been a town that has grown via our economic success. And we have enjoyed, a lot of us, the prosperity of that. There are many more in our communities that do not enjoy the prosperity of that, and that is something else that we should consider, because that reflects in our housing crisis. And there's a housing crisis. So again, you pick your figure out of the air. What does that mean for affordable housing? And I know I keep coming back to this, and I keep banging the drum on this. We all do. But the reality is, when we only build 65 affordable units out of the hundreds that are built over a period, it is embarrassing and shocking and shameful. Because that is people who cannot afford to get on the housing ladder and get in a proper accommodation in our borough. Yet we're having this debate about 853 housing numbers. You see what I mean? It's the contradictions within our debate of our own that is an issue here, not the figure itself. On the other side of that, and I think this is a really important part of this debate, is the River Loddon, is the environmental sensitivities around Old Basing. Why was there no development in the Liberal Democrat Labour local plan years ago in that area? Because we all agreed across party that that area should be protected because of the environmental sensitivity. I don't think that's changed. What's changed is the pressure from the developers. What's changed is the pressure because of government and because of where we're at with this local plan. That's what's changing in the context of these issues. And that, if you look at it, takes you in a different direction. If you take the environmental considerations, it takes you in one direction. If you take the housing crisis and the housing need and the housing issues we face, it takes you in a singular direction. And if you take the economic growth arguments, it takes us in another direction. The conversation we're not good at is actually having a debate about what we want our town and borough to be, really. That's always been the conundrum, hasn't it? It's always the difficult one. And in that, I think we have to be honest. So where the local plan is saying one thing, and the LEP is driving us in a different direction, it raises concerns for me because of what the recommendation is asking us to do tonight. And I genuinely believe that the leader, in the comments that have been passed in our committee, and the things that he has signed up to at LEP, leave us in a position where if the inspector looks to the organisation for evidence, they will present it in their direction of travel. Now, the LEP carries weight with government inspectors. It carries weight with government. It is their beast. Not our beast, it's their beast. It is the body to which they give billions of pounds. Yes, that we are benefiting from in terms of the M3 and Black Dam. Yes, we will benefit from in terms of other elements. But there's still the funding gap that we have to face regardless of all of that. How do we fill this infrastructure hole? How in the world do we fill that hole? You know, because Kennel Farms already come through, Razors Farms come through, Kiln Farms, all of these have come through and not a single one of them is going to contribute to SIL. And again, that reflects about this debate on numbers. So for me, I don't want us to be disingenuous. I don't want a dishonest debate with the residents about picking a figure that somehow is going to be held up as some sort of totem. There's some sort of figure that will be beaten out of one political group for taking one position and another political group for doing something different. That's the reality of it. It's the way it's been used over the past 20 years. We saw an example of it this evening in terms of the politics of this. I'm not stupid enough not to know what the politics of this is. That isn't being honest with the people of Basingstoke. We have some really environmental issues that are desperately important, that people care about, be that open space, be that green fields, be that the River Loddon, be that the environment in which we live. We then have a housing crisis, a crisis of overcrowded, a crisis of proper social housing neglect in our town that we really need to address. And we have an issue to do with economic growth and the sort of economy that we genuinely want. How in the world do we deal with that triangle of issues that are pushing us in different directions? And I don't envy Mark because he is in that position. But his own colleagues in his cabinet, in the administration, are driving different agendas. The politicians in this town at this moment are driving different agendas. That does not serve the residents of our borough. And that's why I just want some honesty about this. If you want economic growth, that comes with consequences. If you want the environmental things to become priority, that has consequences. It also has implications for the local plan and the inspector. And if we want to try and drive a middle road through this, then we need to try and at least have that conversation with residents, to be honest with them, about the realities of what the inspector is going to do. Because you're not saying the inspector hasn't got a position. Of course he does. He's got government guidance that is driving him in a particular direction. How we respond to that is the challenge. So it's obvious, it's blatantly obvious that you take what the inspector says in his letter and you work to it. There's no need for these recommendations in some respect. Mark, what you're going to do is blatantly obvious. You're going to respond to the inspector's letter, and you're going to do the work that is required based upon the expectations that he has laid down in that letter. It is blatantly obvious what you're going to do. You don't need to ask us. That is what you will do. What the conclusions you come to out of all of that is a different matter, because you're the one, and your administration is the one, that will have to decide where you sit in the balance between the environment, the economy, and the housing crisis. That's the reality of it.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. Councillor Parker.
Thank you, Chair. Listening to Councillor Harvey, I started to think that we'd got hustings off already. But actually, I wouldn't. Actually, I wouldn't want to take the content of what he said away. It was very eloquently put. And I don't want there to be any confusion, or at least I don't want to be myself under any misunderstanding of the conclusion of this report and the recommendation of this that this committee is being asked to make. Because whilst, yes, a case can be made that the conclusion of the report is that the policy off figure of 850 is the start, but the recommendation makes it quite clear that this is the figure for the local plan, and is also quoting the job creation range of 450 to 600. Well, I can easily vote for 850, but I think a point that does have to be made, and it was made by Councillor Mrs. James, or I go back to when Councillor Tilbury spoke to this committee, and he said, made reference to endless growth. When is it going to end? Well, it'll only end if we decide as a local authority we no longer wish to be considered a growth area. And we have a team of people promoting this borough as a growth area, promoting what's good about living in Basingstoke, what's good about coming and working in Basingstoke, what's good about coming and visiting Basingstoke. We've got forward planning officers, we've got Destination Basingstoke. The chief executive and the executive team spend a lot of time in talking up the town. Leader of the council attends the various, and we've talked about our representative to the Enterprise M3 partnership, promoting the borough as a growth area. I was disappointed when earlier on Councillor Harvey made an attempt to link the Enterprise 3 debate and the Enterprise 3 partnership influence on the local plan. And it is documented in here, and it's significantly comments are made in relation to the Enterprise M3 partnership feeding into the local plan. It is in here, so it's wrong, it's disingenuous to suggest that it isn't, and it won't. I think personally we are really selling, the selection of the 450 to 600 jobs is selling the borough short, and I do agree we have this balancing act that we're trying to ignore. If it's evidence-based, then we may have to refer back to the paragraph 5. Just one second, you'll have to bear with me on this. Paragraph 511, where it actually states, as outlined in the council response to the inspector's concerns, When considering past housing completion rates against job growth, if the same ratio between housing completions and job growth was applied to the figure of 748 homes, this level of growth could support between 406 and 1,197 jobs per annum. It's in the report. You know, this is officers' report. And I also would like to endorse Councillor Watt's comment. I feel considerable sympathy for our officers who've lived and worked with this. It's been in, it's been out, it's been this, it's been the other, and to some extent, but unreasonably so, they may fall foul of criticism. And I think I do have considerable sympathy for them. So what do? We can look at, do we add 100 houses? Do we add 50 houses? Do we add 75 houses? And do we then get it into the report for the inspectorate to kick around? I actually think, in all honesty, yes, Councillor Harvey says we'll do possibly what the inspector asks of us. I rather think, reading through some of his letters and his report, I think he lost his way a bit as well. And I think to some extent he got himself a little bit confused over what he was suggesting and recommending. All we want to do as a committee is to believe that the job creation factor is correct, that it's realistic in relation to our ambitions for this town, and that also it satisfies the housing need to support the jobs. So I have concerns over the two recommendations, the way they're being presented, but I can certainly easily vote for 850.
Councillor Leek. Sorry.
Sorry. Thank you, Chairman. You may all recall that last July I actually voted against the adoption of the local plan, largely because I wasn't happy about infrastructure, and I've heard quite a lot about infrastructure tonight, but I didn't see very much about it in this report, or indeed in the inspector's exploratory meeting. Edge Analytics report is full of statistics and trends. In my view, neither robust nor reliable. Who of us 6 months ago predicted that oil would be less than $50 a barrel? And what are the consequences for that? We're already seeing job losses in Scotland. It may stretch further. Who at 9 o'clock this morning predicted that the central bank in Switzerland would reduce its interest rates to minus 0.75%? And do we know the consequences of that? It's going to have a profound impact on interest rates and currencies. So I don't trust all these statistics, and I certainly don't trust anything that goes through to 2029. And I don't really believe we're going to create all these jobs on basic view. We've been talking about that for an awful long time. We spent years developing our local plan, taking into account the comments from local residents. And we settled on the figure of 748 dwellings. Now, one man tells us that he doesn't like it. Just one man. My ward, Sherburn St John, is being asked to take over 3,000 houses at Manydown, 450 at Marnell Park, not to mention the developments on two sites which are almost in the ward and used to be, namely 700 homes at Park Pruitt and 700 at Merton Rise. And then we've got within sight Cufford Lane, and you can see Cufford Lane quite easily from Vine Road, as you all know. And if we're all protecting Old Basing, which a lot of people seem to want to do, and Chinham, and the southwest, where are all these houses going to go? I know where they're going to go. You're going to dump them in my ward. And how much infrastructure is being provided? The LEP's just given us £3.5 million to spend on some new traffic lights on the A340. But I haven't read about anything else. What is going to happen on the A339 from Basingstoke to Newbury? Have I read anything about the Western Bypass? No, I haven't. And until I do, I won't be happy. We need a Western Bypass. And locally, just to give you an idea, every night in my village, there is a tanker supplied by Thames Water to pump out the excess sewage. And they were there when I went to Monk Sherman Parish Council meeting at 7 o'clock last night. And they were there when I came back at 9:30. And it's every night pumping out sewage because we haven't got adequate infrastructure. And now we're talking about even more houses. And where's the infrastructure? We can't do it. My residents tell me that enough is enough. And personally, I cannot support an increase from 748. I know it's arbitrary, but another 100 and something, 102 houses or 105 houses is going to have an impact on infrastructure or the lack of infrastructure. And I do think before we actually decide on any number, we really must know where is the infrastructure funding coming from. So for once, I agree with Councillor Tilbury. You can't plonk all these houses in the villages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Leake. Debate. Councillor Behrman.
Chair, you invited me to possibly move this forward. Just before I say anything else, a couple of things. There's not much of what Councillor Leake just said that I would disagree with. My heart is with him. The one thing that is real, though, being pragmatic about it, is this government inspector might be only one man, but he's a hell of a powerful man. I mean, he is in many ways a dictator, not in any way being unkind to him as an individual, but the status of the job that is given to him by localizing central government is that he is there to carry out the will of central government, and that's jolly well what he'll do. And if he doesn't do it, he'll be in a lot of trouble and be overridden probably by the Secretary of State. So at the end of the day, what he says, like it or not, is going to be 98% of the influence on how we move forward. That's how I understand the process. Now, I might be completely wrong, but that's how I see it. Now, I represent a ward that is in the longer term probably been seriously damaged by the lack of the housing land supply, because if anybody doubts that Razors Farm is going to have a mega impact on our ward, well, then they are on a different planet than I am, and I suspect you are, Chair. You're nodding. So we, in that ward, have suffered the consequences of the lack of a housing land supply. I have jumped up and down. Like Councillor Leake, I voted against the local plan, because I thought it was flawed in so many ways, and I wouldn't have come to where we are had I had the dictatorial powers of the local plan inspector. But I can't close my mind to the fact that we are where we are, and that we've got to try and do a certain amount of damage limitation. And the only way that we can do it, as I see it at the moment, is to try and nudge things throughout the local plan inquiry process, but accept, sadly, and I didn't think I'd ever say this, accept the constraints that are put upon us. I wholeheartedly agree with Councillor James in terms of you can't be asking for all these wonderful jobs and then have the sort of figures we've got here. But then again, those figures that we've arrived at, I'm talking about now the job numbers, is as a result of the inspector's guidance. And it's for that reason only that I would support what's here. Very reluctantly, not with a contentment, but just to try and preserve other wards from the sort of damage that Chinham has been subjected to or likely to be subjected to, and to move forward with something that can eventually come together. I hope the process does mean that we can get the how the housing numbers and the jobs aligned in some way. But I think we perhaps need to consider a further clause 3. Now, I've done it sort of rather hurriedly, but I do wish somehow that this LEP issue be included as part of our recommendations. What I've written down here, if I can read it, is that the borough urgently engage with the LEP to work towards synergy on the topics of housing and employment numbers. We've talked about it. I think it's a massively, as I said earlier, important thing that we are saying the same sort of things, because it's going to confuse employers, it's going to confuse potential residents if we don't have a clear message. And if they're going in divergent directions, it can do us a lot of harm, economic harm, for those that are particularly interested in that topic. And for that reason, I'd like us to get our skates on it and get some clarity on the dilemmas that Councillor Harvey has rightly brought to our attention. So I suggest that, and given that, I move the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Behrman. I'm looking to my left. Is there any objection from the portfolio holder or the officers to that addendum number 3? With the committee?
I don't have a problem with taking on board what Councillor Behrman has
Yeah,
said.
absolutely.
And when you voted, I'm going to just say a couple of words.
Yeah, Councillor Felt, we try not to have votes under the Constitution at these committees. What I'm going to make a suggestion. A is that motion as amended with an additional recommendation line seconded.
Does it require a second?
Thank you very much. Now, there are different views within the committee. There's no doubt about it. I would like, let's try and get this, that is there a dissenting view on some members of this committee against this recommendation? Is this just to get a flavour, can I assume that there is a, Councillor Musson, I'll come back to you in a second. On the 850, is the 850 a good starting point? Would we have an agreement on that? A consensus agreement on that? Well, okay. Okay. Councillor Musson.
Thank you, Chair. I feel very awkward in this because I think we've heard Scottish MPs criticised for coming down to Westminster and voting on things that won't affect them, and I feel a little bit like that. Yes, you know what's coming, because unfortunately we have a strange situation where we've got severe restrictions on development. So it's a big academic, really, but I must speak for the people of Tadley and say that we would like some development, because it brings with it infrastructure, and the A340 is becoming, we hope, but certainly with no development there's even less hope of infrastructure, and there's less hope of children having somewhere to live locally to their parents. And the A340 is becoming increasingly congested, yet we don't have any more houses, so it's obviously not from Tadley residents, and that brings with it lots of problems. So I would certainly support my Councillor Leake's request for a western bypass, because I think that would have an effect. So to answer the question about the 853, I could support that, but I would ask that we look again at the Tadley situation and the restrictions and the impacts on that. I think there is more possibly that could be done, because I saw an application go in for 40 houses in New Road, an application made by Hampshire County Council, and in that the consultant they had used in their report that went along with that application, the consultant they'd used made what looked to me like a fairly convincing case for the fact that that would be accepted by the Office of Nuclear Regulation. So there appears to be some flexibility. So I'd like us to look again. I know it's putting more work on the officers, and I apologise for that, but I'd like us to look again at the Tadley situation to see if perhaps there isn't a bit more flexibility that could be had in light of that. And on that basis, if we could do that, I'd be prepared to support the figure of 853. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Muston. I think the officers have already made a note of that Tadley request. It is a special case because of Aldermaston. We all know that. And it's also, you have a proximity to West Berkshire as well. So that is another consideration there. So there's a disconnect there. So we're aware of that. So that has been noted by the officers. How are we going to word this on the 850? Do I assume that the party on the left is going to oppose the 850? No, sorry.
I think it's 1 for 1.
Is it? You know what they're thinking, because this is what the portfolio holder
Can I
needs.
just interrupt? Councillor Harvey did actually suggest that all the comments be recorded, and I think we should note the comments, and that really is it. And I'm not sure that we can.
Okay, if the portfolio holder is happy with that, because this is addressed to the portfolio holder.
As long as my own comments are recorded.
Yes, and this is what we've been able to do with this committee, that the various comments have been committed and they've been recorded into the minutes. So on that basis, yes, Councillor Bim.
Just be reassured that what I put as formal amendment is emphatically part of it.
Yes, yeah, the LEP lineage, that will go aid to the portfolio holder, and the officers have made a note of that as well. And I think the portfolio holder would like to sum up.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you to all of you. We may not agree on everything, but the things that you have said, I have taken on board, and I will look at what each and every single one of you have said, and it will guide me. I would like to just say one other thing that I think it's important we just put back into context. And because one or two of you in the course of the heat of the discussions might have accidentally said one or two things that might have sounded as though they weren't too complimentary about the local plan as a whole. I should just remind you that when we met with the inspector, he indicated that there were 4 possible outcomes, and they were: one, that he would have such serious concerns which couldn't be rectified that he would be advising that the plan would be withdrawn. Well, clearly that didn't happen. That 2, all concerns could be resolved and we could carry on, and you can decide if we're almost in that category. 3, there will be a temporary suspension to enable the council time to sort everything out. Well, that hasn't happened. And 4, that we would battle on regardless of what he said and not have any regard and of any of the warnings and concerns that he's raised. Well, we haven't chosen that one. He turned round and said, and I think this is important that all councillors take this on board, especially when they are considering a local plan and telling people on the doorsteps about it, that he said that the plan was generally well written and user friendly, and he added his congratulations to the way it was constructed and presented and to its content. So it was not, as one or two people have said, a shambles or anything else. It in fact is a well-written local plan that deals with what we need for the future of our borough, but there are some serious matters we need to revisit, which is what we're doing tonight. So I would again like to thank the officers on your behalf for the hard work that they've done and for the hard work they're going to continue to do, and again thank you for your comments tonight, the constructive ones.
Councillor Jones.
I mean, what the concerns were from, I guess, members of the Labour group was not about there were concerns about the local plan, but was about the process that we've got to, and the cost and the time and the impact that it's had on development and communities. So and that's what has been farcical, and that's what I stick by is farcical, and it's had a financial as well as a social impact on this borough and its residents.
noted. It's history, it's gone. What we're trying to do now is move forward to get a local plan. Did you want some clarification?
Yeah, I want to know whether we're going ahead with these two, or whether
Are
we're
you quite happy to
and
accept it?
exchanging it with, instead of taking over.
Right, thank you very much. And item 8 on the agenda is the work plan. We've got 2 more meetings now scheduled, and I think everybody has had notification of this for the 4th of March and the 12th of March. Now, what will be brought to us on the 4th of March is, if you like, a consolidation of what the officers are going to be working on now that we've pushed this forward, and we'll be going through the cabinet. And that will be looking at sites as a consequence of the numbers. 4th of March, work program. Sites.
Constraints and then sites.
Constraints and then sites. Constraints, and on the 12th of March, we're looking at sites.
Might be constraints and sites. You've got the member briefing to remind us about on the 29th of January.
29th of January also is a all members briefing by, I think, Jill, you'll be doing that briefing on the whole ball of wax as far as the inspector is concerned. That's to all members.
Yes. Can I just clarify, Chairman? On the 29th of January, we're having a member-only briefing, which will set out all the different potential options for the sites. It's being done that way so that you can, as it were, briefed on the myriad of options, alert us to ones you think we might have missed out, tell us directions you think we should be going in if we think we're not going in those directions, and you can take them away and discuss them with your residents and anybody else you think is relevant, so that when decisions are made at the beginning of March, you are, as it were, up to speed, and you can also make inquiries with the officers in the meantime. It seemed to be rather difficult to present a paper without having some preliminary discussions with all of you having an input, but bear in mind we may be stretching out and looking at sites that we haven't yet considered for obvious reasons if the number goes up. So it seemed to be better to have a first stage engagement with all of you, and then a second stage where you've obviously got to make some decisions. I hope that makes sense. And obviously it will be interactive, member only discussion, but no decisions to be made. Informative. Obviously you can inform the officers and me if I'm well, I will be there, but you can inform me if you wish, but it's not there for decision making at that point, or but it's there for information so that you can see what the options are and come to some sort of view in due course.
Chairman,
Councillor Leeks.
I've already notified officers that I'm unable to attend, but it is, as I suspect some of these new sites will fall in my ward, it would be enormously helpful if I could be notified as soon as possible after that meeting on the 29th so that I can discuss it with my various parish councils. It's not just one. It's
if you make yourself available for a briefing, I'm sure they'll brief you on what they briefed other members. Provided you don't get too stroppy.
Right, members, that's the good. Councillor Parker. I'm trying to draw this meeting to a close.
Chair, I just want to refer to the item 2, which is on the timetable on the back page of work programme. Basingstoke Town Conservation Area Review and Management Plan. This, I want to draw your attention, Chair, to the fact that this work is long overdue, realising completion. There's been considerable staff shortage in that department. The lead officer that was on a secondment or some sort of temporary contract was then the officer that was developing this programme decided not to renew the contract, and so that work was effectively, in a sense, his influence in the recommendations and the assumptions and conclusions was lost. I do think somewhere this needs to be considered? You've got it as timetabled, but you're not giving any indication here when we're sort of hoping to be looking at this.
As I started out at the meeting, what we're being driven by now is the work that's got to be done on the local plan. And the next two meetings, 4th of March and 12th of March, will be occupied by that. I'll get committee services to ask the officers if they have the resources and when. You can?
Yeah, I could probably answer that.
Okay. When that's available?
As far as I know, they have got someone coming in, I think either this month or next month. And they sent me quite a long email about it. And essentially, as soon as they're in, they can start looking at this again. So I'll follow up with them and then let the committee members know where they are in that, if that helps at all, or through the chair, I'll do that. Sorry.
Well, definitely, as the ward member, I would like to be advised as to what stage we are at in relation to completing this piece of work.
That's one thing that we will do, and we'll certainly notify you and notify the committee as well. But I'm sorry I'm a bit vague on the what's coming out of the March, the sites and constraints work that we've got to do in March. That's driven by the timetable we're trying to achieve to get to the consultation. Yep. But don't worry, you've put your marker down, Councillor Parker, thank you. And there's other very important things that we have to consider outside of this, but like this evening, I'm not asking you to stay from now on because I've excused the officers from procurement and commissioning. We will re-timetable that separately away from the committee, I think, because our time is too precious at the moment. We've got a lot to do. Thank you very much, and thank you for all your contributions tonight. They were very valuable. Good night. Safe journey.